Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation, The CECL Journey, CECL Transition Project Planning for Community Banks. We have a very informative program for you today, and we're looking forward to getting started. I'm now going to turn over the presentation to Peter Čerpak. Peter is an Executive Vice President, Partner, and Senior Director of Ardmore's Credit Technology Group. He is also a thought leader in CECL and stress testing nationwide, having given presentations for the American Bankers Association, the Risk Management Association, C-Bank, and others. And he has also been published in the American Banker, the RMA Journal, the ICBA Journal, and many other publications. Peter?
Well, thanks, Matt, and thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. Try to give you a practical view of planning for CECL, and hopefully it'll be useful to you as a takeaway. And those of you who are looking for copies of the slides, drop me a note. You can either put a note in, as some have, on the note pane here on the console, or you can just drop me an email. My email will be listed at the end, and we can go from there. So for a little propaganda here from Ardmore, Ardmore Banking Advisors, if you're not familiar with us, we are a full-service risk management firm that's been helping community banks and smaller institutions manage their credit risk for over 25 years. We have various services, including loan review, outsourced and co-sourced, credit risk consulting, if institutions are under agreements or are looking to change policy or looking to do M&A work. As we also have credit data automation services, which is the division I manage for Ardmore. As Matt mentioned, we've been working mostly on CECL and issues relating to CECL and stress testing as we look at concentrations for CRE being more important than previously in the minds of the regulators. We also implement a CECL-ready software program from Argus Information Services, and we've helped a number of banks get their CECL projects underway and implemented software to support that as well. And we're proud to be sponsors of most of the major banking groups and institutions, and working closely with them to make sure that we bring best practices to our prospects, clients, and attendees of our webinars. So we do want to do a couple of polls. We think polls are useful because it helps get people involved and also gives us more information about really who's in the conference. So the first poll that we want to do is just real simple. We want to just ask you when your date is for CECL, so we know with people on the phone. And so if you would be kind enough to just click on the button so that we can just get an idea anonymously how many institutions are in the 2020 group and in the 2022 group. And if you're not sure, you can also indicate that as well. I know there are some on the phone who are not banks, and so you don't have to vote. You don't have to say you don't know. Great. Well, we appreciate it. It helps us understand our audience and try to make sure that we use your time the best. And it's interesting because we're getting a pretty good division, almost 50-50 between 2020 banks and 2022 banks. We'll show you the results in a second. I guess we'll close it now and show you just for your info. And interestingly enough, it's dead even, 2020 banks and 2022 banks. So thanks for voting. Appreciate the input. The other thing we want to ask you right up front is where you are on your CECL journey. I mean, this is a question we ask a lot in our webinars because of the fact that it's something that, particularly for the 2022 banks, are trying to understand where you are in your journey. So if you can help us out with that. The question's on up right now. This is a marathon, not a sprint. Journey, it really started in 2016 in the summer when this was announced. And there's been a lot of talk in the press about banks trying to assume that small banks won't have to do CECL, or hoping there'll be some kind of exemption or some kind of delay. And so it's always interesting for us to see who's doing what And so we're going to close that down in a second and get into the actual webinar portion. And we'll show you where people are in just a sec. Okay, so you can see here that it looks like it's pretty even between planning and looking at automated solutions, but more than half of the people on the phone are past that, reviewing and improving data collection and the like. You know, obviously, if you're a 2020 bank, we would hope that you would be past that place in the process. But thank you for your input. We're going to move on now to the webinar itself. Okay. We'll do a poll at the end as well, just to see where you are. So now let's get into this whole issue of project planning. Why is this important now? And why do we think it's important that institutions have a guide as to what to do? We've been told by the regulators themselves in Ask the Regulator webinars and also talking to our clients that your institution, whether you're a 2022 bank or not, is going to be asked what your project plan is to get to CECL compliance. You'll have to give an update every time you do a safety and soundness. Those who are SEC filers are having to actually put this in writing, basically saying where I am and how I'm going to get from where I am now to CECL compliance. So what follows is our view on best practices around building a CECL plan and maintaining it. Obviously, at this point, if you're a 2022 bank, 2022 seems like it's a long way away, and you may not have a very clear view of what the endpoint's going to be. So it behooves you to start simple and then increase the specificity and complexity of your plan as we get closer to implementation. So with that, you know, why do we project plan? And the project plan, a formal project plan, serves a number of purposes. And I say formal, I mean, obviously you can scratch out an idea of what the main milestones are, but formal project plan has a lot more to it than that, and it's something that you can use as a constant reference as you go through the process of implementation. It documents the ideas. This is important because when you put together your CECL narrative, one of the things that you're going to have to do is prove to the regulators and the auditors that you've gone through a process of careful decision making and with a clear rationale around how you want to approach CECL. By having a project plan and documenting it, you can have something that can communicate to all of the involved people in the institution and outside what you're trying to do, what their expectations as to what you can do will be, and how each of them are going to be affected by the CECL transition. So it documents that you've been thinking about it and that you have ideas around it. It also acts pretty obviously as a roadmap. So if you know where you are and you know where you want to end up, and a good project plan fills in steps in between, then it can really help you take a look at where you are on the roadmap to CECL compliance at any time. Similarly, it's a yardstick. How far have you gotten? So if you thought you were going to be sitting in let's say you're a 2022 bank, and you know you want to be running parallel in 2021, then where should you be in 2019? Are you ahead of that or behind it? If you're a 2020 bank, and that means that next March you're doing your first CECL calculation, where did you think you would be at this point in early 2019? And finally, as I alluded to in the first point, this is your evidence that you have a plan of action and that you're underway and you're making progress. You'll be able to update your project plan and show that as an example that you are moving forward on CECL and you're dealing with key decision points. Also, be a way to document what your rationale is as far as what decisions you make about CECL. In other words, when you write your first narrative, you're going to say, our CECL committee considered different options around buy or build a solution using peer data or not, what methodologies I want to use. All those decisions should be documented, and the fact that you made them and when you made them, it's all part of the project plan. One maybe word of caution or something to consider is that your detailed project plan may not be something you want to show to regulators and auditors. You may have a public project plan that has all the pieces, but maybe some of those details you might want to keep to yourself as far as the nitty-gritty stuff. Okay, so why, in particular for CECL, is a project plan a useful tool? Obviously, it's a regulatory expectation that you have a project plan. There's no question about that. But one of the reasons why it's important for CECL in particular is that CECL is a wholly new process for an institution. So we're basically getting rid of the old ALLL process and adding a whole new process. So having a plan which anticipates problems, which sets dates, which coordinates activities and sets expectations is important. CECL impacts many different departments in the bank, and we'll talk about that in a moment when we talk about resources, but I know some smaller institutions where you wear many hats may think, well, you know, I've got this, but the reality is CECL impacts everything from lending, and I think recently in the American Banker, they had an article about how uncertainty around how credit cards are treated impacts that. Long-term commercial mortgages may not be as profitable due to the life of loan calculation that CECL requires up front. So lending can be affected. Operations can be affected because of the fact that you may need to collect more data at origination, and which means new boarding sheets and new processes. Obviously, internal and external audit are affected, and finance. So it really does impact a lot of areas of the bank. If you have a plan that everyone can see and see what's expected of them, that makes it a lot easier to coordinate. And logically, there's a lot of interdependencies between these tasks. So if you can't do anything until you collect more data, and IT can't give you more data until it's been input, and you can't input more data until you've updated your boarding sheet, then obviously you have to think through the process. And this is part of project planning, as you know. You have key activities that link to each other, and you have different people performing them. So a plan will help you manage those linkages in a critical path. It's a multi-year, complex process. And as I said in the beginning of the webinar, you know, this is definitely more of a marathon than a sprint, or it might be a series of sprints, depending how you look at it. But because it is such a long process, having a project plan allows you to not lose sight. It's quite possible that you'll have changes in staff or even organization during the CECL process, and having a plan that you can refer to as to what you had intended to do can be very valuable. So it's not quite rocket science, but it is complex and long. And as I mentioned, having the plan for CECL is important because it's an expectation and a documentation of the decision-making process that you've made to prove that you've actually gone through that. But let's not forget, CECL is an incredibly subjective rule. It is not a regulation. One of the reasons I think there's been a lot of confusion in the press and sometimes with smaller community banks is that they're waiting for regulators to tell them what to do. And while regulatory guidance would certainly be welcome, regulators have made it pretty clear this is a financial accounting standard, not a regulation. So they want to support GAAP. They want to make sure that you're following the generally accepted accounting practices, those are the regulators, but they don't see this as a regulatory requirement. That said, they're the ones who will be enforcing it, so we think that they should help you a little bit more than they have perhaps to date. Okay, let's talk about what some of the components are to the project plan. What we usually recommend to an institution is to start out with the two ends of the process. So if you're a 2020 bank, you know, your end is basically March 2020. If you are a 2022 bank, you have a couple more years. And so where you are in February or March of 2019, how do you get to the endpoint? Once you have laid out the end-to-end roadmap, you need to identify the major milestones to get from here to there. So, and we're going to walk through those, some examples of those for you. Then you've got to assign some target dates, because you know some of these things are long lead time activities, particularly when you're talking about data collection and assembly and archiving. Other things may be relatively quick decisions that have to be made. You can start to line these up as you build your map of time and timeline. You have to have assignments. It may be the assignments are by department. They may be by individual, depending on the size of your institution. It may be that you have someone in your IT group who's looking at different options for databases and data warehouses or applications to help with the calculation. It may be that you have departments who are responsible for putting controls around some of the activities. It's something that you're going to have to do as you lay out the milestones. Critical path is what we say in project management are the absolute must-dos. And if you reach a go, no-go spot, that's usually part of your critical path. And what is it that you need to have done to make that decision on the critical path? That's part of what you'll try to look at. And you're going to need to flesh out the subtasks underneath the major milestones. I'll give some suggestions of those with dates. And then finally, something that is often lost is that you need to perform regular updates. If you have a project plan, you've laid it out, and even if you are following it and it's almost exactly right on time, you want to be able to show that the tasks are complete. This helps all the stakeholders involved and also shows the regulator where you are in the process. So it's pretty important. Let's look at some components of this, some milestones you might want to look at. We talked about where you start and where you end and where you are now. Let's look at some milestones that you could consider. And we're going to go through each of these milestones into some depth. And again, I'll make this slide set available to you at after this webinar. So first thing you got to do is get your resources aligned in your plan. Second of all, you've really got to deal with data because it's the long-term, probably the longest duration task you have to worry about. Then the next set would be segmentation and pooling considerations. We'll talk about that. Then it's a buy or build or both. What are you going to do about your CECL calculation? There are pluses and minuses to be considered for different options. Then you're going to be looking at your life of loan loss and loss projection methodologies. I think a lot of time and effort's been spent on this in webinars from regulators and others, and in reality, this is just one step. Q&E factors are still going to be part of CECL. No matter how subjective it is, you'll still have to be able to do the standard regulatory 9 categories. There will be new ones, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, reporting, justification, and documentation. This process is highly dependent on the narrative. Because it's so subjective, you'll be making decisions and choosing to do things based on what you think is best for your institution, and that requires all that being documented. And you may find that your project plan actually gets folded into the documentation itself. And finally, parallel runs, a milestone that would be typically right before you were to go live. So what we're going to do now is look at each of these and talk about them. So the first milestone we talked about was project resources. Project resources are always where you want to start. And it's always the hardest thing, particularly when your resources are being borrowed or stolen away from production responsibilities. I think all institutions have that pain. Only the largest ones who have resources that are available to assign to special projects can handle this without some degree of difficulty. So we mentioned before the multiple departments that are affected by CECL. Here are some examples. I have one core provider listed up there, but your core provider, third-party vendors, external audit, accounting and finance, and then within the bank, you're looking at risk management people, lending, IT, audit, finance, ops, accounting. All of these people are going to play a role, and they have to have some resource was assigned to your CECL committee. And so it may be a part-time person, it may be just an hour a week. Some of these, as you'll see as we go through this, some of the activities that you have are more resource intensive than others. One of the reasons why a lot of smaller institutions have gone with a vendor to help them is they simply don't have the resources available to spend the time to research and practice and try different methodologies, different calculations, different tool sets. So you may choose to have a vendor that helps you as a consultant through the process. You may choose to hire a vendor to sell software to manage a CECL calculation, or you may try to do it all on your own if you think you can pull it off with the resources that you have. Once you get your resources together, the CECL committee is usually the term that's used in the industry. This doesn't necessarily have to have a member of all of these, but it certainly has to have the key members, and then they are responsible for communicating out what's going on to the other resources or other departments involved. And it's important to explain why CECL impacts them and is important. A lot of people in the institution don't know what it means and don't know why they would be involved. For example, an operations person in loan ops or an IT person may not know what it is and why it's important. So that's the beginning of what you're doing. Getting buy-in. This is something you're going to have to do because it is a financial standard, and not complying with it means that you could have problems with regulators and auditors, and nobody wants that. So buy-in shouldn't be something that should be hard to get because it's got to be understood this is not an option. It has to happen. But just the same, you want people to feel that they're part of the process and have interest in seeing success. So bringing these people together will help you do that. And again, identifying those owners by the different areas who will be responsible for communicating and either making decisions or performing tasks as needed for the project. So this part impacts obviously your timelines because if people aren't available, deliverables, and so as your milestones are set up to complete and you don't have people or resources to do that, and obviously expectations around what can be achieved with the resources that you have. So it's an important first step. The second step, we always go into data. Data is the foundation of CECL. Data is needed for a number of reasons. And one of the first things you really need to do is do an assessment of what your data quality is and its applicability to doing the CECL calculation and supporting justifications for the CECL rationale. So the first thing you're going to need to know is what are the CECL fields that I need? What is my gap between the fields I need and what I have? What do I have to improve to collect more data if necessary? And what are the coding standards and controls that I have? It may be in the past that miscoding a loan. I remember talking to someone in loan ops who said, yeah, we're trying to get the lenders to pay more attention. Then we get something that comes down the pike and it says, this is a multifamily property, and then we look at it and it's a horse farm. I mean, yes, there are multifamilies of horses, but that's not the appropriate bucket. And that could impact CECL now and could impact your capital because if you decided to break out, for example, CRE into property, some of the larger property types, in order to be more risk-based in your pooling, and the people responsible for assigning property types to the loans really don't understand the credit implications, it could be a problem. So you may need to have new controls around how data is coded, how loans are coded, how many people touch that loan between the time the decision is made and it gets into the core. And also you have to look back historically because a lot of CECL is about justifying life of loan loss, and life of loan loss usually goes back into history quite a ways. You need a remediation plan and actions. So do you go out and get more historical data? Can you? Do you have sources? What we usually find, I should mention Ardmore does credit data assessment for CECL for institutions. We've probably done 25 to 30 of these in the last couple of years. And what we usually find is there is historical data somewhere. It may be a loan ops who's doing a snapshot every month end and putting it in Excel of the portfolio. It may be finance who downloads their ALM system, a series of data points each month or quarter. It could be any number of things, but you've got to go find out where it is and find out whether you can use it and whether or not it's validated information. Then you may want to add more data now. So if you're a 2022 bank, you have 2019, 2020, and 2021 good data if you start updating your loan origination data capture right now. So you might want to consider doing that. And again, looking at things from origination and how it flows all the way through the process. One of the things Ardmore does when we do our assessment is we do a flow chart for each major asset type, the origination process and systems, the main coding standards, who does what, who's responsible, from really decisioning all the way through to the core and then out into reporting. Data management and controls, internal handoffs. Does anybody go back and check, and how often? What kind of quality control is in place to ensure the data quality is good? This, again, may have been a nice to have in a previous environments that may have just affected reporting. Now it affects your ALLL calculation as well, or your ACL as they call it now. Another factor in this is peer data. One of the things the regulators have made pretty clear is that if you don't have the data, you're going to have to go get it, and if you have to go get it, you may have to pay for it, or you may have to adjust it, because if you're using UBPR data or call code data, that may or may not match your pooling process, in which case now you're going to have to adjust that data and somehow justify it. So is it reasonable and supportable? Do you have to use Q factors to adjust it? What kind of peer sources do you have? So you can see that the data aspect of this is large. It's a long-term process. You want to start early because of the time frames and the long lead time involved, but it's going to be part of the process all the way through other threads of your project plan. Having the data is going to affect your ability to do life of loan estimates. The data is going to affect your ability to do a reasonable, supportable loss projection of the future. And also, as I mentioned before, because of the subjective nature of this, there's going to have to be a lot of justification for why you believe you're taking the right approach and your rationale is sound. So there'll be a lot of documentation and justification. Having your own data is the best justification for explaining to a regulator why your choices were good. Using external data or Q factors is probably the least supportable, which would mean it'll need even more justification. So, pretty key aspect of the process. Pools, segmentation and pooling considerations. Once you have data, that's going to drive some of your further decisions. So we talked about project dependencies. You can't really decide what way you may need to modify your pooling segmentation until you have the data in hand and understand the quality, because that's going to make some decisions for you. If you don't have LTVs, for example, you're not going to be able to segment by LTV. It's pretty obvious, but you don't know until you look. And once you look, you don't know until you test to see how valid the data is. We did a credit data assessment for I guess it was a $2 billion community bank. And when we dug in, we found that there were multiple LTVs in use by different groups within the bank. Some were using LTVs that were system generated by the core that changed based on balance. Others were looking at original LTV that was in a loan origination system. So the process is important. Objectives is the first thing you might want to consider. Why would you change your pools? I think just about everybody would agree that we just as soon leave our pooling the way it is under the current ALLL methodology. But because CECL is different, has that life of loan component, and you may find that there's benefits to breaking out your pools differently. This is something the industry is still trying to get its arms around, even at this late date, as to what works best. Does it make sense to isolate losses, or does it make sense to put losses into larger pools so that they're spread across the pool? We're trying different methods now with our client data, our 2020 banks, to figure out the best way and what makes a difference. But I always think there should be a reason to do it, and here are some reasons that you might change your pooling structure. It might be that you can lower the amount of your reserve. It could be that you can create a less volatile reserve. Again, if you have very few losses like most community banks, one loss can create a huge spike, and it could have a major impact unless you're properly having that data housed in a larger pool or based on the projection that you do. It may be easier to calculate life of loan loss if you separate out things like vintage of loans or terms. And it may be easier to apply certain methodologies based on how your pools are broken out. I mentioned term, risk rating is another one. So there's a lot of reasons to do it, although I think most banks are not going to be changing their pooling unless they see a substantial advantage to doing so. There's operational concerns to doing that, obviously. If you want to change your pooling, the first thing you're going to have to do is probably look back at your loss history. You're no longer going to have loss rates based on the same methodology as you have today. So you may need to go back and restate your loss history, and then you may find, well, gosh, I don't have, for example, if I wanted to break it out by CRE category, I don't have property types in my historical data that I can use, so I can't go back and do that for, we can only do it through an estimate. So there are different operational concerns with changing your pooling structure. I mentioned peer data. If you have call code-based pools now, peer data is more easily applicable. But if you change now into sub-pooling, you no longer can use peer data without a lot of adjustments. And again, risk-based pooling is part of the CECL concept, but how far is too far? If pools are too small, then you're going to have results that won't be very useful or justifiable or supportable. If you have pools that are too large, you won't be taking advantage of risk metrics within that. So making these decisions, which is probably a pretty early decision-making thing for institutions around CECL, impacts your loss and projection methodologies. It impacts potential capital change. So if one of your objectives is to minimize the impact on capital or to try to get less volatile impact on capital, pooling can be important. And we mentioned the third-party data and Q factors. So this is something that for a 2022 bank, we think by the end of this year, you should be starting to think about. If you're a 2020 bank, you should be at this or past this. Next milestone we're going to look at is the build or buy. So again, we can step back for a second and think about the fact that we've now gone through the process of trying to figure out what data we have. We got a project group together. We've looked at what data we have. We've looked at our pooling segmentation. Now we want to know what we're going to do with it. Do we want to try to build an internal model to do the calculation? If so, can we manage our data and control it and make it auditable? Or is this basically a spreadsheet-driven process that is liable to either mistakes or having to put an extraordinary amount of controls around it to make it auditable? And who's going to maintain it? Do you really want to, if you have to break your pools out and bring in a ton of data, do you really want to be responsible for manually doing that every quarter? What resources do you have? These are all considerations for building and buying. And if you go with an external model, then you're looking at things about vendors, obviously, budget is important, linkage to the core, ease of use, flexibility. I mean, this whole thing is evolving. If you pick a vendor that's got a one-tier model, basically, that here's the way it runs, and this is the one we support, and it's not flexible, and there's no guarantee that we're going to make any changes to the model, or we're going to charge you if we do. We recommend that our banks go with vendors who are flexible, who will work with changes in the industry as they happen, who have multiple methodologies that you can choose from. Is far superior than having to go down one track with no way out. So this decision impacts, obviously, budget, timeline, resource requirements between how much your vendor helps you. And that's another important factor if you do pick a vendor-driven solution. Is that vendor simply going to train you how to use the software, or are they going to help you become CECL compliant? In Ardmore's case, we always try to help you become CECL compliant. Well, we are not an accounting firm or an audit firm. We can give you the options and tell you what the best practices are that are evolving. But this is an interesting decision, and there is some lead time involved in this as well. So life of loan, loss methodologies, and projection methodology. This is where we see most of the focus of institutions. They're mostly concerned about that. But I can tell you that if you've looked at the project plan milestones up to this point, you'll see that a lot has happened before we can even get to this. If you think about dependencies, it's going to be really hard for you to do a life of loan loss projection methodology if A, you don't have the data and you don't know what data you have, B, you don't know what pooling you're going to use and how it applies, and C, whether you have an application that will do the calculation for you, or whether or not you're going to have to manually try to do these calculations yourself and lay in the controls that are required. So loss rate calculations, there are more than this. These are 5 different ones. One of the things you'll find if you are doing your plan and talking to vendors is that different vendors use different lingo. So some might call something a cohort and others would call it a snapshot. Others might call it open pooling or closed pooling. You need to understand what it is they're talking about. Vintage is something that I think was intended to be one of the main methodologies for CECL, but what we found is banks don't feel particularly comfortable with vintage, and it requires a lot of data over time. PD/LGD is probability of default, and loss given default is something that's tough to do without a lot of third-party data. So we don't see a lot of this in community banks, but some may be able to do it. The WARM method, or the weighted average remaining maturity method, is a method that is not really supported by the accounting community, although even recently the Fed and I think the FASB came out with something saying you could use it as a start. It's considered a rather unsophisticated methodology that actually proves to not be particularly effective. It's really an ALM method. But right now, you could use it as a starting point. The concerns in the industry are that if you use this as a starting point, transitioning to a more sophisticated risk-based methodology, there's going to be a lot more work. So I would caution banks who think that this is the one way to go, because eventually you're going to have to switch, and now you're doing it twice. Discounted cash flow is another methodology which you can adopt, but again requires extensive use of data that may be outside the scope of a lot of community banks. And you need to understand, if you have the data that you need to support which methodologies and how you're going to make it happen, what the quality is, and if you have enough depth of history, because that may knock some of these methodologies out of the box right away. And also your portfolio. What kind of methodology is best for retail versus commercial versus real estate versus consumer? There's a lot of different angles. Some of these seem to be surfacing, and Ardmore is monitoring this. There's a talk about the fact that if you've got a lot of data, say you've got a lot of consumer lending, that may align well with a vintage methodology where larger credits or more sophisticated riskiness may require something that's a little more individualistic, like a cohort snapshot or a PD/LGD. So these decisions have to be made as they impact, obviously, data. The whole testing process can impact your capital if you use one method over another. The whole volatility of your ACL calculation, and justifications and controls, because the more data you have to pull in. One of the things the regulators have said is, we don't want you maintaining all your data on a spreadsheet. That's not good. I mean, you might do the calculation on a spreadsheet, but you really don't want to do all of the data store that way. So you may find that some methodologies require more or less. Q&E factors and support. This is an area that's pretty murky. Really, the purpose of the Q&E factors as they are today are to adjust calculated amounts to make them fit your portfolio better. Mike Gillette, who is the head of accounting for the American Bankers Association, he and I talk about this a lot, and he likes to say that CECL is easy until you get the result that you don't like. And it's Q factors that might be able to allow you to bring that result back to something you do like. And so we do work a lot on trying to figure out how to justify Q factors and align them with get results that are more important. So you're going to need to support your Q&E factors. So if you already do that for the typical regulatory 9, but now you're going to have Q factors such as, here's a Q factor that adjusts peer data loss history to be more like our portfolio. Here's a Q factor for the economy, the future economy, and projections of losses. Here's a Q factor for adjusting, say, real estate based on unemployment rates or housing starts, but applying it to our local market. So it's going to be really, really important to have data to support the story that you tell. And let's not forget that under CECL, you may well be adding reserves at a time when the economy is doing well, or taking reserves out at a time when the economy is not doing so well, because your future projections are things are improving. So having Q factors to do that are attributable are important. The American Banker white paper on this talks about 4 groups of these. The portfolio mix set, where you talk about how your portfolio is constructed, the kinds of assets and the kinds of changes over time. Loan performance, loan age and maturity. That's very important because you're doing life of loan projections, what your seasoning is and where you are on the loss curve. And then forecast and collateral values. Other things to consider would be peer data. Q factors just that, and macroeconomic factors. It's pretty tough to find macroeconomic factors that will impact a smaller community bank. So you might be taking regional or even national figures using Q factors to adjust those. Obviously, this impacts the approval of your whole CECL process, reserve amounts, and justification and controls. This is an area that is still evolving, and we're going to be looking at the larger banks and how they're acting, as well as just trying to use common sense, but it's tricky. More data you have, the easier it is to justify. And the 7-step, I guess it's not quite a 7-step process, but is reporting, justification, documentation. All of this stuff. There's new disclosure requirements. There's new narrative reports that are required. You have to be able to tell your story, because really you're doing this very subjective calculation with all kinds of rationale of your own that you think is best for your bank. You need to be able to tell that story and justify it. You also need to document the entire project. So the project plan, as you can see, sort of feeds itself. What are the decisions that you made? How did you challenge them? One of the things that we're hearing is the regulators don't want to, you and the auditors don't want to see that you just, call up a vendor and said, we'll do what you say. We want people involved because they have to own the risk and challenge the ideas, what are the assumptions, what loss models, and you can see the documentation of that whole process. Let's not forget that phrase, reasonable and supportable. So that means supportable means you are supporting it with rationale, documentation, supporting data. All of this are things that you have to be collecting all the way along your project of implementation and being ready to have for your narrative, as well as the required disclosures. Obviously, there's a lot of impacts of having that. So those are the 7 milestones. Where are you in this process? The 8th milestone, that is probably the one that most people spend their time worrying about, is the parallel run. And that's where really the rubber meets the road, which is why we have those roads there. I don't consider them really parallel. I like to use the term simultaneous comparison runs because they're not really parallel. There are things you do at the same time, but they're not apples and apples. They're apples and oranges. So what you'll be doing is running your current process and running the CECL process through a number of cycles and seeing what the impact is of the calculation on the capital levels and reserves. So your parallel process may be to test by pool, by methodology, for loss rates and projections, and using peer data or not. You're going to want to compare those results by pool, by total, look at adjustments, and think about attributions for change of your calculation. How are you going to adjust for what you think is coming down the pike as far as the economy and your portfolio? One of the things that I think people get confused about is they think CECL is requiring you to project the future economy. No one has done that well. Economists are kind of like weather reporters. You know, they'll give you directional things based on information they see. They're usually wrong. The Fed itself, which used to put out all these projections for their DFAST calculation, was usually wrong. So that's not really what CECL is about. It's about projecting how your portfolio is going to act. And one of those aspects is how they'll act under economic change. And if you have the data, you can talk to that and you can justify how you believe a portfolio acts under different changes. So those changes could be internal, they could be external, they could be economic. It's not necessarily just predicting the economy. But the parallel runs will be a way to shake down and see how that all works. So when you're done, you might have something that looks kind of like this for your project plan, which lays out different areas of focus. Month, this case it's showing quarters in the beginning, months detailed out, and you can track where you are in the process. It can be something as simple as this. It could be more complicated. This would be more of a milestone list. There'll be subtasks underneath it. If you're good at Excel, you can collapse things and expand things and the like. So this is kind of the goal state that you want to get to. So where are you now? There are obviously two paths that you're following. If you're a public business entity, you have a slightly shorter path than the non-public business entities. And some of the things that are needed to be done in 2019 for the 2022 banks is really worry about the data and the project management and planning and getting your resources together and putting together a project plan, whereas the 2020 banks are clearly at the position of doing CECL parallel runs and fine-tuning the results of what they choose to do. So if you're on this map, where you are is kind of important. So what we'd like to do now is do another poll and ask you about where you are on your CECL journey. And so if you would vote on this one, we'd greatly appreciate it to get an idea of where you are. Thanks. We'll just give a minute. And again, we're just trying to get an approximation of where you think you are in the process. And we know 2022 banks and 2020 banks will be in slightly different positions. So we'll give it another minute, and then we'll close it out. Again, thanks for your input. Always good to know. Ardmore really thinks it's important that we are reasonable and moderate in what we do. We're not a big fan of telling people to go off and do crazy things that may or may not be important. We understand that particularly community banks have really scarce resources, and we would never go tell a bank, all right, go out and collect these 90 data items for the last 10 years if we're not absolutely certain that it's a regulatory or audit requirement to do so. But we know that there are some vendors who use scare tactics, and that's caused some issues in adoption as well. Okay, well, thank you. We're going to show you the results of the poll. And it looks like right now, the majority are building a CECL plan, although a third are addressing their data issues. There's a good smattering of those looking at third-party solutions, and we still got about 12% are waiting and seeing. I certainly hope those are the 2022 banks, not the 2020. Thank you for participating in the poll. Okay, so from here, let me wrap up with a couple of things for you to think about. One is, what are the things that you should be doing if you're a 2022 bank in 2019? We talked about this identifying CECL data gaps. You really, really need to do that. Do it soon. If you haven't done it already, and again, Ardmore can help you with that if you're interested, or you can do it yourself. But it's important to understand what your desired state is and how you can get there. And enhancing your data collection at the source, because most of the risk-based credit attributes that you might use for pooling or for justification are in the origination process, and a lot of them get left behind there. It's pretty clear that you need to have an archive, depending on the core. for all of your data is going to be painful. It's expensive as well because they typically will charge you every time you want to pull a file. So it's recommended that you have your own auditable, safe archive of your credit data. And it should be an ongoing improvement. Your worst data should be your oldest, and your best data should be yet to come. So all those things should be worked on. And then probably by the end of the year, you might be thinking about creating new pools if that's necessary. So how can you prepare now? What can we do to help? Just to give you an idea of the data coding and management issues that we often see is borrower financial data is usually the source of most of the information that you need for CECL, along with performance information of the portfolio. Often that goes to origination system, or it could be just a Word document, and then it gets approved, and then it gets interpreted into a credit memo and a boarding sheet, and sometimes that gets filtered through a doc prep system. The doc prep system often will spin off a lot of data because it doesn't have enough capacity to pass through to the core. So you can lose a lot in that step. And as you get down into the core, what we find is then some data is used for operational reporting right off core systems. Others go into core reporting systems and get filtered out yet again so that not all data is necessarily available there. And of course, ad hoc reporting comes from that source, whereas operational reporting comes from another source. And before you know it, you don't have a lot of control over the data. This is one of the reasons why we do a workflow and identify where there are control issues. We also find out that maybe there's an annual borrower financial analysis, but that data is rarely put back in the core and updated. So that's an opportunity lost. And sometimes, again, ad hoc core reporting runs into borrower financial analysis, and you have a lot of confusion in there. Sometimes you use the same data for your ALLL as you would for stress testing and other supporting financial analysis. Sometimes you don't, and your board reports may or may not work that way. And of course, there's that big gap of how you continually update information in the core that's coming in through loan review or credit evaluation. So this is just, I always think of this as kind of like the cartoon. If you're old as I am, you remember as a kid is how does a bill get through Congress? Well, how does data get through to a report? This is kind of the thing that we look at. What you really want is to get from the current state and go through an assessment and a cleanup program that gets you to a long-term, one version of the truth, where you have a central database of information that you can use for many functions. If you're going to go through all this effort, it makes sense to use it as many ways as you can. Ardmore believes in that. So, for example, the CECL tool that we support and implement has in it stress testing, has in it concentration reporting and analytics, as well as doing the ALLL and CECL. It just makes sense. This is one of the hidden benefits, almost any benefits of CECL, which is that it does force you to take a look at your information and help you organize it better, cleanse it, make it more usable. That's a very valuable thing because banking is an information business. So having better information for decision making and reporting is pretty important. Ardmore does a CECL data readiness assessment service. Should be happy to talk to any of you about if you're interested, where we can give you a roadmap to CECL compliance from a data perspective, as well as identify issues with controls and coding standards and the like. Help you understand what are the recommended CECL data fields, what kind of pool criteria should you be looking at maintaining, what is available in the core and how do you populate it. The core has a lot of stuff that often banks aren't using. We can help you with that problem. And sometimes banks have put data together based on acquisitions or some sort of workarounds, and then fields have become available, but they don't know it or they haven't used them. And then what's available and what's not being captured. So some things to think about. What processes need to be changed to really address CECL and better data capture and management throughout. And finally, Ardmore does support a path for particularly the 22 banks. The 2022 banks really probably don't need to invest in a software platform in 2019, but they do need to start with a data capture, and they do need to continue down their path of education. So we do have a solution called the Boot Camp for institutions that are interested in simply archiving data and being having onward education about CECL and what they need to be doing when. Boot Camp is a low-cost solution to get you going on CECL, and it comes with consulting. And then, of course, the software suite. Once you get up past 2020, for you 2022 banks, you should be looking at investing in a platform unless you're going to try to do these models yourself. So we like to think that we right-size our approach for all financial institutions. So that's a wrap-up of where we are. Hopefully this helps you think about your project plan. This shows the solutions, so I'm just going to skip that for now and just show you my email address, because I think I've bent your ear enough today. It's a lot to take in, but project plan is going to be something that's going to be your best friend through a long, complex process like this. And we think it's important that institutions spend some time now putting that plan in place. Ardmore will continue to, in their webinar series upcoming, we're going to do some webinar on pooling considerations, probably in a couple of months. That's the next step for a number of institutions, and those of you who enjoyed this webinar will certainly send you out an invite for another. So thank you for your time this afternoon, and again, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or like a copy of the slides or more information. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.